So before you can talk about anything in mythology, whether it's Greek or Roman or Egyptian or Sumerian, you need to understand the location and the time period that the myth takes place in. And with this story, the majority of the story takes place in the kingdom of Boeotia. Now, Boeotia is located centrally in Greece. It has access to water, it has a mountainous region, you have rivers, lakes, lots of farmland, and it's actually one of the early first five kingdoms that were located in Greece. Now, the major city in Boeotia is Thebes, which is very important in Greek mythology. So, to kind of express how important it is, that's where Orion is from, the Orion's belt myth. That's where Narcissus looked at himself in a pool and turned into a flower. And lastly, but definitely probably the most important, the greatest of the Greek heroes was born there, Heracles. Um, you might know him more familiar by his Roman name, which is Hercules. And the kingdom obviously has a king, and the king at the time of this story is named Athamas. And his queen is Queen Ino. Those are both important names to remember for the story. And as far as where we are mythological time period wise, it usually gets a little murky, but I can tell you for sure that we are very early on. For example, after the events of this story take place, Queen Ino actually raises the baby god Dionysius. So this is before some of the gods have been born. Um, Another thing that lets you know how early this is, Queen Ino's dad was Camdus, who is credited for bringing the writing style of the Greeks to them. So this is very early on in Greek mythology as well as Greek history. And so the king of Thamus had two children. The first was named Phrixes, and the second was named Helle. And Phrixes and Helle's mother was not Queen Ino. It was actually a cloud nymph named Nephele. Now, nymphs in general in Greek mythology are kind of the midway point between a full-fledged god and a human. So, kind of like a god, they have eternal life, but kind of like humans, they usually don't have powers. And we don't know too much necessarily about Phrixes and Helle and how they were or how they looked, but because of the fact that they were part nymph, we know that they were probably very good looking, they were probably more athletic and like radiated a greater sense of person than the average person. This is apparent throughout Greek mythology. For example, another example of a child that was born to a nymph would be Achilles. So usually these children were demigods for all intents and purposes to the eyes of everybody else. And just like every other Greek story, there's usually a theme that revolves around the actions that take place. And this one has a theme that's very common to Greek mythology, and that would be the theme of jealousy. It's very apparent. I mean, even Zeus and Hera have thousands of tales about them because Hera got jealous at Zeus's actions. And the jealousy in this story comes from Queen Ino. And based off of the Greek customs at the time, it's somewhat warranted. As I said earlier, Phrixes and Helle were the king's children, but they're not the queen's children, which means that the king had an affair. So Ino did not like that. And usually in Greek times, if you were a king and you had an affair, the children that were born would not be claimed. You would not claim those children. Those children would have no father's name, and there would be no place for them in royal society. However, this time it was a little bit different because it was with a god, and you're not going to ignore the god, right? So the children were raised by the king. They were accepted by the king. And more importantly, Phrixes was the oldest son that the king had. So now the queen not only has to help raise children that weren't hers, the throne is going to go to someone she did not give birth to. It really hurts her image and her power in society when that happens. So she did not like them. And so she decided that the best way to deal with that would be to get rid of them, right? To have them dead. And so she and her followers came up with a very, very strong idea. They went to all of the locations where the seeds for next year's harvest were placed, and they roasted them all. So obviously the next year when the farmers planted the seeds would not grow because they had been roasted. And then all of a sudden, King Athamas was in the middle of a storm. He, there was no food, food was not growing, his people were going hungry. And all throughout history, you have examples of if the people aren't fed, the king doesn't usually live too long. Um, and plus, honor and duty at this time were very important to kings, and you would not let your people starve. So the king came up with an idea of sending a group of men to an oracle to figure out what they could do to right this wrong from the gods and to have their crops grow. And depending on which version of this myth you read, they either went to a local oracle nearby or they went all the way to the famous oracle at Delphi. That's just something, myths are spread word of mouth. So things get changed every single time. Regardless, these men went to the oracle and they came back. And before they could talk to the king, they were told that they met Queen Ino, and Queen Ino took them aside and said, "Hey, if you tell the kings, if you tell the king that the only way to fix this grain problem and this crop problem is by killing his son Phrixes, I will give you everything you want. You'll have money, you'll have land, I'll make you a noble, etc." So these men lied to the king, and now the king was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one end, he didn't want his people to starve. On the other, he didn't want to kill his son and heir to the throne. But at the end of the day, one man's life is not worth the lives of an entire kingdom. So he reluctantly decided, yeah, okay, we'll sacrifice Phrixes. While this was going on, Phrixes and Hela's real mother, Nephele, the cloud nymph, caught wind of what was going on, and she actually begged the gods to send somebody to help, and the gods sent Aries, who was a golden ram. Now, by all accounts, he's golden and he's a ram, but the thing that differs is if you believe that Aries was sent by Zeus, Aries had wings. If you believe he was sent by Poseidon, he could swim very long distances very quickly. Regardless, Ares comes to the kingdom, takes Phrixes and Hela, and takes off east towards the kingdom of Colchis. Now, the ride there is relatively uneventful until somewhere over the ocean, Hela falls off and drowns. And because of her drowning, that area of the ocean is now called Hellespont. Again, depending on the story you listen to, if the ram was sent by Zeus, Hela drowned and died. If the ram was sent by Poseidon, Poseidon took pity on Hela and made her a minor god of the ocean. Regardless, Phrixes and Ares end up in the kingdom of Colchis, and they run into the king there, who's King Atea. And the king there immediately takes him into his protection, and everything's fine, but Phrixus believes that he needs to sacrifice something to the gods, and he decides to sacrifice Ares. And so he does just that, either to Zeus or Poseidon, depending on the side of the story that you've heard. Now, what happens next is that once Ares is dead, they have a fleece. Ares left behind his skin, which turns into a fleece, which becomes the golden fleece. Now, if you know Greek mythology at a basic level, you might have heard the story of Jason and the Argonauts going after the golden fleece, but that's what happens. And the king of Colchis takes the fleece and hangs it up in a garden and has it being guarded by a dragon. At this point, the story of Ares is pretty much complete. Phrixus ends up going on to marry the king's daughter, Calliope, and together they have 4 children. The oldest one is named Argos, and he is the one who ends up building the Argo, which is the ship that the Argonauts sailed on with Jason, which is kind of ironic because his children end up being the children who helped Jason steal the Golden Fleece back from the king. Greek mythology has a lot of examples where kings are, sometimes good, sometimes bad, especially this king because he was the son of Helios, and son of Helios, and his mother was a nymph, so he was like half god. He was immortal. For all you Greek mythology lovers out there, if you know who Circe is, the witch who was on an island and turned men into pigs, the king of Colchis at the time was actually her brother. With that being said, that is pretty much the end of the story.